Hello YouTube and welcome back to another book review from me, your host Logan Albright. Today I want to talk about A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, not to be confused with C.S. Forster, who wrote the Horatio Hornblower series, which I'm also very fond of. This is an entirely different person, and I've made that mistake before, so don't you make that mistake. This is considered one of the great British novels, one of the great novels of the 20th century. It was written in 1924, and it's the story of this small provincial town in India under the British Raj, when Britain had colonized India and was ruling that country. And that's a period in time that I find really interesting. I am, as you know, if you watch my channel, I'm something of an Anglophile. I love British culture. I also find Indian culture pretty fascinating. I love Indian classical music. I love Indian food. I find Hinduism completely fascinating. So this is an interesting topic for me, and I've read a couple books on this time period. Graham Greene's The Heart of the Matter is one that springs to mind, and I've wanted to read this for a while, and I finally found it cheap in a used bookstore, picked up a copy, and read it, and it's really good. I really like it a lot. The prose is excellent. He's a very good, strong writer. The landscape descriptions really remind me of Tolkien, strangely enough, which is, may seem an odd comparison, but they're both British writers writing in the early 20th century, mid 20th century. And so I guess it makes sense. Maybe Tolkien read this book and was influenced by it, but the landscape descriptions are beautiful. I think his prose is really nice. When he kind of deviates from the plot and the characters and the dialogue and spends a little time describing the landscape around India, I find that really beautiful. The story is basically about this group of English people who are in this small town in India and a couple of Indians with whom they interact. And it's about the tension between these two cultures as they come into contact. And there's a doctor named Aziz, and he befriends some of them. And there's a young woman named Adele Quested, and there's a young man named Cyril Fielding. Cyril Fielding, that's a hard name to say. And he's sort of like the most friendly with the Indians. He sort of is fed up with all the pomp and circumstance of his situation and just kind of is hanging out, and he's getting to know the Indians, and he comes closest of anyone to really understanding them, and he's friends with Aziz. And anyway, they go on this trip to these local caves, the Marabar caves, to see them. And while they're there, Miss Quested, or Kested, I'm not sure, I guess Quested, is something happens to her, and she becomes very distressed, and she accuses Aziz of trying to attack her in one of the caves, and that sort of creates this bigger rift than there already was between the Englishmen and the Indians. And so that's kind of the setting and what goes on, and it's the conflict between those two cultures that's the centerpiece of the story. Now, I find it really interesting because if you read books today and they tackle the subject of race at all, the topic of race, I find that all the ones I've read anyway are very heavy-handed, and they're very moralistic, and they're very lectury, and they always have like a stand-in character whose job it is to lecture everyone else about how racist they are and how they should be more understanding. And I find them very tedious and very unappealing. This book deals heavily with the topic of race and racism, but it does it in what I find to be a much more organic and natural and satisfying way. Because obviously you have this tension between the British colonizers who regard themselves as superior and more civilized than the Indian people. And they treat them quite poorly sometimes. And they certainly are snooty about it and have a superior and arrogant attitude towards it. And then you have the Indian people who are being colonized and who, as a result, hate the English people. And one of the opening scenes in the novel is about the Indians saying how you can't be friends with an Englishman. It just can't be done. And so you have this kind of mutual misunderstanding that you see. And there's different types of it too, because you have sort of the upper class Englishman who is just completely above it all and superior and says, oh, these are savages. We don't want anything to do with them. They'll never be like us. And then you have sort of the slightly more benign seeming form of racial misunderstanding where, for example, the young woman Adele Quested is kind of fascinated by India in sort of a quaint, touristy sort of way. And she's like, oh, I want to have an adventure in India. I want to see the real India. I want to see what it's like. But she really has no understanding of what the people are like or what they care about or what the landscape is like or the history or anything. It's very superficial. And she sort of like wants it as a souvenir for her own amusement rather than as appreciating it for its own sake. And really, Cyril Fielding is the person who comes closest to understanding what the Indian perspective is. But even there's clearly a gulf between his point of view and his worldview and that of Aziz and the other Indians. And I think that's handled really well because there's misunderstandings on all sides. No one is portrayed to be wholly good or wholly evil. The snooty upper class Englishmen who treat the Indians badly are perfectly lovely people when they're around their own kind, and there's plenty of good things about them, but they have some very bad, uninformed, ignorant opinions. And then the young woman, Adele Quested, means well and doesn't have a malicious bone in her body, but she just doesn't understand. And then, the Indians are, perhaps understandably overly hostile and overly suspicious towards these people they have to live with. And they generalize and they stereotype and they paint them with a broad brush. And they don't understand their motives, and they don't understand what they're going after and what they care about. And there's just this disconnect. There's just this lack of understanding that goes both ways. And I find that such a more true to life way of portraying these kind of conflicts, these clash of cultures, than these sort of moralistic, lectury, didactic kind of stories you get nowadays. I've read a couple of them where they're just, yelling at people for not being, enlightened enough. I think that's so unhelpful. And this was really a good book. I really enjoyed it. I really found it gave me a lot to chew on and a lot to think about. And it's kind of a sad book because I know I'm not going to say how it ends or anything, but basically the message at the end of the book is like, we're just not ready. These two cultures are too different to live together. It's a real shame. It's a pity. It'd be nice if we could all live in harmony and view each other as individuals, but human nature being what it is, it's just not going to happen yet. And maybe someday in the future it will, but people are just too narrow-minded and too walled off and too tribal in their allegiances to really make it work. And it's kind of a depressing message, but it's also got an element of hope in it. It's like maybe we can get better one day and do better. And what I also found interesting is that it's not just the factioning off between the Indians and the English. There's also factioning off within the Indians based on religion, because the main characters that we interact with are Muslims. And they view the Hindus who live in India as well with a great deal of suspicion and with a great deal of kind of condescension, and feel like they're superior to them in a lot of ways. So you see the same sort of attitude that the English have towards the Indians portrayed in the Muslims towards the Hindus. And there's like a lot of animosity between those two groups as well. And one of the things that happens when Dr. Aziz is accused of a crime and the English are trying to prosecute him is it unites all of the Indians together. So the Hindus and Muslims who formerly disliked each other suddenly find a common enemy in the English, and they can kind of come together and overcome their differences in order to, go after the colonizers. And I thought that was really interesting, because it's like no group is immune from this kind of tribalism. No group is immune from this kind of prejudice and stereotyping and collectivist thinking, where you paint everybody with the same brush. And I think it's interesting how you see it broken down at the religion level, you see it broken down at the nationalist level, at the race level, at the gender level. It's all these different things, and everybody kind of has attitudes that are not exactly completely open-minded towards other people based on the categories that they are representing themselves as, or that they were born in. And so you really see that like nobody's perfect. Everybody's got these problems. And I thought that was a really interesting way of telling the story. I saw some people criticize the book as being boring. It's true that there's not a lot of action in it. There's not a lot of, things that really happen in it. It's mainly about the characters, and it's about their interactions and the different worldviews that come into contact and clash. And there's some great conversations in here between Fielding and Aziz, where they kind of push back against each other's worldviews and say, well, this is why you Westerners don't understand. You don't have the right way of looking at the world. You have such crazy ideas. And then comes back and says, this is why you Easterners, you Orientals, don't understand the way that things ought to be. And they just have different ways of looking at the world. And it comes from their heritage, and it comes from their religion, and it comes from their national identity. And it's interesting to see those kind of in conflict with each other. But people who can have a conversation about it is really nice to hear that. That was my favorite part of the book, is when you have those conversations. So I don't know much about the author. I gather that E.M. Forster spent some time in India when he was younger, so I assume that he has a certain amount of frame of reference from which to write this book and knows a little bit about the people that he's describing. I thought it struck very true to life, and it felt very true to the way humans relate to each other, and the little things that prevent us from being friendly or from understanding each other, the little emotional hang-ups that you get. Towards the end of the book, Aziz becomes so bitter that he just can't get past it, and he can't continue his friendship with Dr. Fielding, Mr. Fielding, because he's just he's got resentment, and he's got bitterness, and he feels ill-used, and he's very suspicious. There's a part in the book where it says that part of the Indian temperament is to be overly suspicious of other people and their motives, and that it's one of their flaws. And then it lists some flaws of the English, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but everybody's got their flaws that result from their nationality or their background, and yeah, he just can't get past his bitterness, and so it's these little emotional hangups that get in the way of us forming meaningful and good and positive relationships that last a long time. And that's it's a tragic thing in one sense, but I think it's very true, and I think it's very uh, accurately observed by the author. So I really enjoyed it. I haven't read any other books by him. I don't actually know of any other books that he's written, but I'm going to look into it and see if there's anything else I can read by E.M. Forster, because I really enjoyed this. And I thought it was a very enlightening and interesting book, and it brought together those two cultures that I find so fascinating, the Indian culture and the English culture. I really love both of those parts of the world, and I haven't been to India, but I love both of those cultures, and I find them, when they come into contact with each other and you get that combination of the two, I find that to be a fascinating period in history, and I love reading about stuff like that. So if you know of other books along this line that deal with that subject, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. If you know of other books by E.M. Forster I should read, I'd like to know about it in the comments. I really liked it, and I recommend it. If you like kind of slightly slow, character-driven 20th century literature, I think you will like A Passage to India. So that's been my review. I've been Logan Albright, your host. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, leave comments down below, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy.